not getting journalism. We're not serving the
The
public.
media bias, I guess, just depends on which channel you watch.
The mainstream media has gone over the top.
Washington is broken.
They can't stand the truth, and apparently
More and more
the news
people are
media
watching
can't stand the truth.
media that affirms their own point of view.
I can't believe anything that they say. I just really can't.
I think that we need a different point of view other than the Republican and the Democratic Party.
A soldier identified as Major Nidal Malik Hassan opened fire with 2 guns at a processing center, the worst mass shooting in history at a U.S. military base.
And he jumps up and he yells, Allahu Akbar.
He raised his gun, and that's when the bullets started hitting all around us.
I saw the red laser come across my eyes, and he was aimed at my head.
And the first round went in right here.
There was a whole bunch of soldiers running.
It was panic, it was chaos.
This guy's lost his mind.
So I'm looking down the barrel of his weapon. I started firing, and he started firing 6 feet away.
You hear everybody scrambling, and you're hearing calls for help. And I remember hearing a female voice saying, please, please, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant. I heard gunshots, I hear nothing else.
Welcome to the season premiere of For the Record. I'm Lori Dew. Tonight we bring you a 1-hour special investigation into the worst ever mass shooting on an American military base. On November 5th, 2009, Major Nidal Hassan unleashed a 10-minute bloody rampage that left 14 dead and more than 30 injured. Tonight, For the Record shows you the trail of evidence that was ignored by the FBI and the Department of Defense that linked Hassan to international terrorism and his commitment to jihad as a self-professed warrior of Islam. Even though the president and the former head of the Department of Homeland Security have called Major Hassan's attack an act of terrorism, the incident remains officially classified as workplace violence, a distinction that has left many of the victims of that massacre filled with grief, anger, and disappointment in their government. Tonight, For the Record presents Broken Heart.
Private First Class Kam See Chong was 7 when he arrived in the U.S. with his family from Thailand.
We went to Community Peace Academy. It's a small charter school on the east side of St. Paul. And I've been going there since I was 4th grade, but he transferred there in 8th grade. And so we immediately connected and we started dating ever since then.
5 years after marrying his childhood sweetheart, Chong joined the Army in 2008. His first assignment was at Fort Hood.
We were married for 5 years, and we had 2 kids, and I was actually pregnant with our 3rd, and then that's when he joined.
I grew up out in West Texas. I was born in Andrews, Texas, which is west of Midland and Odessa area.
Since he was a young boy, Howard Ray wanted to serve in the military. After high school, he pursued his dream.
Well, when I first joined, I joined the Texas National Guard, and I was a tanker. And I followed that career path the entire time. I was in the Army for 13 years.
Ray eventually became a combat soldier, manning a tank in Operation Iraqi Freedom. His unit famously became the first since the Vietnam War to face 30 days of continuous combat.
We went through a whole host of things like mortar attacks, RPGs, and IEDs, stuff like that. I never really imagined that I would be put in a situation where I would have to get out before, 30 years. I was going to do this till I die.
I was born and raised in Carolina Beach and was an avid hunter and fisherman with my father, doing the tomboy thing. I went into law enforcement at 23 and decided that I had this desire to serve my country. So after a few years in law enforcement, I joined the military.
Kim Munley became a chemical operations specialist.
What I thought it was is being in a lab or blowing things up, sort of action type. My company that I ended up getting in was actually a decon company, so It was basically, we had power washers for vehicles.
After the Army, Munley returned to police work. Once her former partner, Sean Appler, was struggling with a suspect during an arrest when the 5'3" Munley flew into action.
I ran down the hill and jumped on the guy, wrestled him. We eventually got him subdued, sprayed, so forth, but Sean sort of assigned the name Mighty Mouse because he said out of the corner of his eye he saw me flying through the air and tackling this guy.
In 2005, Munley moved to Killeen, Texas, and became a civilian police officer at Fort Hood. She joined the Special Reaction Team, known as SRT.
My SWAT commander, who was prior military, ended up having to hire about 15 people to man their SRT. So I got interviewed and had to try out for the team and ended up making it. It was very tough, but it definitely was worth it.
Well, I was born in Roxborough, North Carolina, which is 30 miles north of Durham, and I was raised there until the age of 12.
Alonzo Lunsford's dream was to be like his dad, a former military and civilian police officer.
My father used to always say that you never doubt where a person came from, or you never look down on anyone, because just as easy as you have received anything in life, it can be taken away from you. And multiple times in my life, I've crossed that path.
After high school, Lunsford joined the Army, where he became a psychiatric specialist.
Initially, when I joined the Army to be a military policeman. However, the school for the military policeman didn't start for 6 months later because he was booked. And I ended up going to the medical field.
Less than a month before the Fort Hood shooting, Lunsford would meet the man behind that bloody day.
Major Hassan and I, we first met and worked together on the 18th of October, 2009. He was a regular guy. We worked together. The initial meeting that we had was not under the best circumstances.
According to military records, Hassan had a track record of poor performance in carrying out his duties. That night in the hospital, he even tried to defy a court order requiring him to admit a mentally ill patient.
And so I said, well, Major Hassan, I was a psych tech, and one time, I can help you. He says, well, would you please? I said, yes, by all means. That's what we do. And we shook hands. I extended a right hand of fellowship to him.
Nidal Hassan is the American-born son of Palestinian immigrants. In 1988, he joined the Army, then attended Virginia Tech, then entered medical school. In 2003, he began his residency at Walter Reed in Bethesda, Maryland. While there, Hassan gave a series of lectures on Islamic ideology, where he discussed how non-believers would go to hell and justified suicide bombings, among other things.
The fact that you would have somebody who's engaged in Islamic supremacist rhetoric, who's wearing our uniform, would on its own be a red flag.
Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor. In 1995, McCarthy led the successful prosecution against 12 individuals, including Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, known as the Blind Sheikh, for the 1993 World Trade Center bombing and other planned attacks against New York City landmarks. He says Hassan should have been the subject of a thorough investigation well before he arrived at Fort Hood.
Post 9/11, we're now on a war footing where national security is actually given precedence over law enforcement protocols. Obviously, anybody who you know or reasonably suspect to be an al-Qaeda operative is a major national security problem. You're not trying to just build a case like you would do in ordinary criminal times. You assume that you need to be all over that al-Qaeda operative until you get proof that you shouldn't be.
According to a post-incident review known as the Webster Report, in December 2008, the FBI field office in San Diego began tracking Hassan after his repeated attempts to contact al-Qaeda leader Anwar al-Awlaki, a man killed in a U.S. drone strike in 2011. The investigation was eventually turned over to the Washington field office. By June 2009, Hassan and al-Awlaki had exchanged 18 emails. Despite repeated pleas from the San Diego office to investigate further, the Joint Terrorism Task Force in Washington, which included representatives from the military, determined that Hassan did not pose a threat.
I think when you start looking at the conversations, the substance of it that they had before them, and you look at these other activities, you had at least probable cause of a conspiracy offense already, if not enough evidence to go to a jury and seek a conviction on either a terrorism conspiracy or a seditious conspiracy, or one of the offenses that we have repeatedly used in terrorism cases.
In the FBI's final correspondence regarding Hassan, a Washington agent explained to the San Diego office that the subject was, quote, politically sensitive. The FBI's investigation was over.
So what I'm saying is, you're at the point where I think, at a minimum, you probably have enough evidence to indict. You quite possibly have enough evidence to convict once you lay out everything you know for a jury. So it's simply mind-boggling that we could be talking about whether there was enough to investigate.
The Webster report also showed that a San Diego FBI agent was so surprised by the lack of response in the Hassan matter, he suspected that the major must have been a confidential source for the Washington office of the FBI. We'll be right back. Welcome back. According to the Senate's official report on Fort Hood, the Department of Defense and the FBI collectively had sufficient information to have linked Major Hassan's radicalization to violent Islamic extremism, but failed to act. That lack of action left Hassan free to kill those he considered his enemy.
I woke up at 04:30 and I was preparing breakfast for my kids, and I didn't want to catch the bus that day, so I was gonna take them to school.
He normally doesn't give us kisses and hugs and our kids before he leaves, but that morning, he did that, so.
That morning really began like any other morning. I checked in like I was supposed to my platoon sergeant, let him know what I had going on for the day.
They had a tasking that day and pulled most of the SWAT guys off the road. And I told my SWAT commander, I said, if you don't need me, I'd rather stay on patrol. So we needed another extra officer, and we called the K-9 division and asked them if they could spare one of their officers. And so they did, and it was Mark Todd. And I had never even worked with him before that day.
We medically process service members and civilian contractors that are deploying to theater and returning from theater. Just being the coach, I give a positive quote for the day to get everybody pumped up. Winning is an all-time thing, not a sometime thing. There's no room for second place, first place, or only place. And then we break off and we go to our normal stations.
I actually had pulled up to our transportation motor pool to wash my patrol car. We have to keep them tidy. And I'd had a break in the day and decided to go ahead and wash it.
I put it in reverse and I was like, oh, wait a minute. And had my gun on me, I had to take it off. To this day, I guarantee if I had known what lay in store, 25 minutes later, I wouldn't have ever taken it off.
And this was after lunch at about 1:15. And Major Hassan was sitting at station in the chairs to go to station 13.
I asked him to come home for lunch because he said he's just waiting in line. And he said no because it was almost his turn. So he's just gonna wait and get it done with because that was the only week for them to get all their paperwork and stuff processed.
Major Hassan gets up out of his seat. He was on my right-hand side. He was about 3 to 5 feet from me. He jumps up and in a loud command voice, he yells, "Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar" twice. He reaches up on the right side of his uniform top and he pulls out a weapon and he goes fist and palm like this. And he points the weapon at the soldier sitting down. And he had a laser on the bottom of the weapon. He turned the lasers on and we're still wondering why is this man turning on his lasers. So he starts discharging the weapon.
I had my hat and my glasses laying on the table, and I just kind of looked out the window, couldn't see anything at first. Then you start hearing everybody running around and saying, you know, this guy's lost his mind.
I got the call that shots had been fired, so I jumped in my patrol car and responded as normal.
You just saw soldiers that was grabbing themselves and they were slumping over.
My friend actually came over with her daughter and we were outside playing, and that's when I learned that there was a shooting.
I switched modes. It was so quick. It was unbelievable. It took longer to explain it than what really happened.
Then my coworker, my dear close friend, Dr. Michael Cahill, came at Major Hassan with a folding chair. And he had the chair above his head. When he tried to hit Major Hassan with the chair, Major Hassan turned the weapon on Dr. Cahill, and he killed him in cold blood.
I texted him, but he wouldn't reply back anymore, and I called him repeatedly and he didn't pick up either. It's not like him not to answer my texts or answer my calls. And so I was worried. I knew that something was wrong.
There was a whole bunch of soldiers running, and some of them were hiding behind this wall that leads out to the street. And a lot of them were doing hand and arm signals, telling me which driveway to pull into.
He was sitting in the second row, and he was one of the first few that was shot. He died immediately.
It's not about what I saw, it's what I smelled. Blood has a very distinct smell. And blood mixed with gunpowder. And that never leaves you. The smell of blood and the screams. You hear everybody scrambling, and you're hearing pleas for life, calls for help.
So we start pushing everybody out the door, and everybody gets out. Ultimately, put boxes in front of them and shove the refrigerator in front of the door.
It was panic, it was chaos. It's like a bottleneck at the back door. And when I got up to get ready to run, something said, "Turn around, check your six," meaning look behind me. And when I looked behind me, he already had the weapon pointed directly at me. And he had the laser, so I blinked, because I didn't want the laser to blind me. And when that happened, he discharged a weapon. And the first round went in right here. It knocked me back 2 steps. I spun around, I hit the floor. As I'm laying there, hearing the screams, hearing the gunshots, smelling the gunpowder, I remember hearing a female voice saying, "Please, please, I'm pregnant, I'm pregnant." I heard gunshots, I hear nothing else. You have to dig deep. And I wasn't gonna die like that. The only thing I had to fight with today was a laptop computer and a pen. So my thought was, just let me get to my Jeep. it's got to be something in my Jeep that I can fight. So my momentum, when I came out the back door, it took me to the drop-off, and I tumbled. Like I shot again. So as I'm laying in the grass, he came out after me.
I swept my shirt back to grab my pistol. I looked down into an empty holster. I just kept looking back, and then he did come around the corner, and he raised his gun, and I just said, here it is. I focused on making sure that she wasn't going to get hit, and that's when the bullets started hitting all around us. I just looked at her, and she's out of breath and crying, and I said, we've got to go. It was then, when we actually started leaving, that I started hearing sirens coming toward there.
Most people were running away from the scene, and he was coming towards, and then realized when I saw the red laser come across my eyes, and it was definitely him.
And I remember they break up a truck, and they put me on a tarp, and he's still shooting at me while they're triaging me. So I started singing. I'm trying to sing Amazing Grace, and I couldn't get past the first verse.
So once I started firing, it took his focus away from shooting other soldiers, and he started focusing on me. I started firing, and he started firing 6 feet away, and we both fired many times. Then he hit me in my thigh, which didn't really hurt too bad. But then he hit me in my knee, and it took me down like a sack of potatoes. I still have my weapon, and I'm looking up to try to fire again, and then my weapon has a malfunction and jams. So I'm looking down the barrel of his weapon, and he tries to fire his again, and his weapon stalls and jams as well.
If his weapon wouldn't have malfunctioned, where would he have hit you?
Oh, he was standing right over me, so he was aimed at my head. He couldn't use his left hand. It was paralyzed at the time, and he couldn't pick up my weapon, so he kicked it out of my hand. Hassan had managed to fix his malfunction, so Hassan started firing at Mark Todd, and then Mark Todd returned fire, and the last shot pierced his spine and dropped him. I scooted myself up against the wall and saw an exit wound on the inner part of my thigh, and blood was squirting out like a water main, so I knew right away, and the color of the blood was black, that he'd hit my artery. But I was on scene for over 40 minutes waiting on medical attention to come in, but the scene was not safe, so they had, it took a while to come on scene. Only thing I can explain is divine intervention, because when I got to the ER finally, and they put me under for surgery, I'd flatlined, I'd lost so much blood. I was still conscious, but just the last things I remember is them yelling, we're losing her, there's no pressure, and then I go under for surgery.
Typically, you apply direct pressure wound side up. So I'm turning my head this way, he's turning my head back this way. A couple days later at the hospital, they come and see me, and I asked, I said, well, thank you for, helping me, but why was you turning my head? And he says, because Major Hassan was right beside you. Smart, because I was still in the fight or flight. Had I realized he was right beside me, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you today.
What happened at Fort Hood was a tragedy, but I believe it would be an even greater tragedy if our diversity becomes a casualty here.
In the Hassan matter, he is a terrorist, and he was an active duty military individual.
And that pull towards extremism appears to have led to the shooting at Fort Hood and the bombing of the Boston Marathon. So that's the current threat. This is the future of terrorism.
The Department of Defense can no longer subsume that reality within vague, inexact, and politically correct terms like violent extremism or workplace violence. It is violent Islamist extremism.
Congress must fully understand this example of home-based terrorism in order to find ways to help prevent it from occurring in the future.
Two of the most important agencies of this government still haven't defined what happened at Fort Hood. By even mentioning that Islamic terrorism had anything to do with it.
They shamefully have classified it as workplace violence.
I think whoever contrived that nonsense is the only person in America who believes it. Anybody looking at these facts knows that's a crock.
Welcome back. The day after the Fort Hood attack, the National Counterterrorism Center, a U.S. agency under the Director of National Intelligence, labeled the incident as a terrorist attack. But that classification would change and have a profound effect on the victims.
I don't remember too much waking up in recovery, but I do remember asking the nurse and the doctor said the first thing I said when I woke up was, how many got shot? How many are dead?
The Fort Hood massacre left 14 people dead, including an unborn child, and more than 30 wounded.
It was the next day already, and it was like 3 o'clock in the morning, and I heard the doorbell ring, and I went to look, and through the window I saw 2 men in uniform, and I knew what that meant.
On November 10th, 2009, a memorial service was held at Fort Hood. Howard Ray arrived to honor the fallen.
I showed up in my dress blues that day to go to the memorial ceremony, and I wasn't allowed to go to the memorial ceremony. I don't know why. To this day, I don't know why.
Private First Class Cam Gong came to America from Thailand as a small child. He was a husband and father who followed his brother into the military because his family had a strong history of service. He was preparing for his first deployment to Afghanistan.
I was in a daze. Like, I didn't even feel like I was there. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just following instructions, following the CAOs, and just doing what they asked me. And, you know, I felt like I was just sleepwalking.
After the service, President Obama met with some of the victims.
He just gave me his condolence and just said that we won't be forgotten and that they'll make things right.
Alonzo Lunsford remained in the hospital for 3 weeks. The local community tried to offer comfort, and school children delivered homemade get well cards.
This little boy, he had the prettiest blue eyes and blonde hair you ever want to see. When he gave me the picture, he took 2 steps to the rear and he rendered the most proper salute that I've ever seen in my 22 years, 7 months and 28 days of military service.
Lunsford wanted to return the salute, but couldn't. He was unaware of the extent of his injuries until his fiancée handed him a mirror.
That's the first time I saw myself. I had a tube coming out of my nose, IVs out of both arms, a tube out of my head. My head was out to here. I had a catheter. I had a tube coming out of my stomach, and my legs were in this compression apparatus, and I lost it. I'd never been hurt that way before.
In January 2010, Kim Munley underwent knee replacement surgery.
Literally 2 days after I got home from the hospital for that surgery, I got a phone call requesting our presence in Washington for the State of the Union.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's definitely an honor which is once in a lifetime, and I'm glad I got to do.
After President Obama's speech, Munley attended a reception where she met the president.
I was in a wheelchair, but I did have a cane, and to me, I really thought that it was important to stand up and walk a few feet to shake the president's hand. But when I stood up, the president looked at me and said, "What happened to you, honey?" And the First Lady sort of nudged him and said, "That's Sergeant Munley from Fort Hood." He said, "How are you doing?" I said, "Good." He said, "Everything okay?" I said, "Well, yeah, for the most part." And he said, "Well, don't worry, we're gonna take care of all y'all." I said, "Well, thank you." It was definitely a good experience. Looking back now, I would do it again, but I believe now that I was used as propaganda, and that's the only part of the regret I have.
That regret was anchored in how the Obama administration and the military would eventually classify the Fort Hood shooting, beginning with a January 2010 report from the Department of Defense.
Included, the DoD force protection programs are not properly focused on internal threats such as workplace violence and self-radicalization. The problem is compounded in the absence of a clear understanding of what motivates a person to become radicalized and commit violent acts.
The Defense Department is part of this administration. Okay? The Secretary of Defense is a political appointee of this administration.
John Carter represents the 31st District of Texas, which includes Fort Hood.
It is all about the administration's policies on political correctness.
The report did not mention Hassan by name and contained no reference to Islam as a motive in the attack. More telling was the military's overt attempt to classify the shooting as workplace violence.
I was struck by the fact that the premise started with the concept that this was a workforce violence incident. There's no indication that I see that shows that this was any pressure of his job whatsoever. It was a mission that he had taken on.
Well, it was never workplace violence. I would say that workplace violence is a joke, except it's offensive. What happened at Fort Hood was a jihadist terrorist attack, and trying to hang a sign on it that says something else not only doesn't make it something else, but is actually offensive to the people who were victimized by that atrocity.
It wasn't workplace violence. It was an act of terror against American heroes, and we need to speak the truth.
Two subsequent investigations, one commissioned by the Senate and another ordered by the FBI, condemned the way in which the U.S. government has handled the incident, specifically for not addressing the warning signs that Hassan was conducting himself as an enemy of the U.S.
You look before the Fort Hood shooting. Nidal Hassan was in repeated email contact with Anwar al-Awlaki, a known radical terrorist leader. Now, the federal government knew that. We had that information.
Anwar al-Awlaki is somebody who not only is suspected of being an Al-Qaeda operative, but is someone who actually ministered to the 9/11 hijackers. That would be the 19 terrorists who took the United States to war. So if I had a member of the uniformed military having repeated contact, not just contact, I mean any contact would be something to scrutinize, but repeated contact with someone who's suspected Al-Qaeda operative, obviously that would be something that would be very serious and have to be scrutinized very carefully.
In several email communications with al-Awlaki, Hassan expressed his desire to transfer funds to the terrorist leader. During this investigation, For the Record has also learned that a suspicious activity report was filed by the Bank of America in February 2007, when it was discovered that Hassan was transferring large sums of money to the Arab Bank of Palestine, a bank currently fighting federal charges of funding terrorism in Brooklyn. There were at least 3 transfers, 2 for more than $20,000 and 1 for $150,000.
Any financial transaction that appears to be beyond the means that you can observe of the person who's involved in the transaction is something that ought to raise alarms. But what always raises alarms is foreign transactions, and particularly foreign transactions where there's a heavy terrorist presence, as there is in Palestinian territory.
His business card said Soldier of Allah. He was conducting jihad, and he's been very candid that that's what he was doing.
During his trial in August 2013, Hassan referred to himself as a mujahid, or holy warrior, and said he had switched sides in America's war. He also declared his actions that day were to protect the Taliban from the U.S. military. We'll be right back. Since November 5, 2009, President Obama and members of his administration, including the former head of the Department of Homeland Security, Janet Napolitano, have referred to Hassan's actions as terrorism. But the Obama administration and the Department of Defense refused to officially classify the Fort Hood shooting as an international terrorist attack. According to the Army, that means soldiers killed and injured that day are disqualified from receiving Purple Hearts and the combat-related services and benefits that go with the award.
Fort Hood, it is abundantly clear this was an act of radical Islamic terrorism, and the only explanation for the administration's persistent denial of that is politics, and that politics should not obscure the truth. We owe it to the victims of Fort Hood to speak the truth, to recognize that they died protecting this nation, and to honor and acknowledge them for their sacrifice.
I think there's a clear indication that this is a Muslim terrorist event. I think it should be declared such, a foreign terrorist event.
Prior to Hassan's murder trial, the Department of Defense argued that awarding the Purple Heart would have indirectly classified Hassan as a terrorist and claimed it would have made it harder to get a death penalty conviction.
You didn't want to compromise the case.
Didn't want to compromise the case. I wanted to get a legitimate conviction. And so from that, my conscience told me I had to stand down on that. Now, in the political arena, that doesn't play very well when people are counting on you and victims are coming and wanting to be part of the launch of this legislation.
While honoring the Army's request not to push for Purple Hearts, Carter and other members of Congress tried to pass financial assistance legislation similar to that granted to the victims of 9/11.
We've twice had the language in the Military Authorization Act, and twice it's been taken out.
Why? Why do they tell you that gets taken out?
They say they can't pass it out of the Senate with it in there. So it's somebody in the Senate.
Well, unfortunately, the way the Senate operates under Harry Reid and the Democrats is that just about every decision is done behind closed doors in Harry Reid's office. And he shuts down any discussion or debate.
Carter said even though he couldn't get a financial reparations bill passed, he was assured that once the trial was over, there would be no more excuses to deny military awards and financial assistance to the victims.
I had a general, and I won't mention his name, come to me and talk to me and say, look, if you'll wait till it's over, I'll be on the stage with you when you launch this.
Major Nidal Hassan was declared guilty on all charges, and on August 23, 2013, he was sentenced to death. Carter said, "It is now time to help the victims."
I made him a promise I would keep trying. I'm keeping him trying. Right now, I have 240 co-signers of my bill to give them the medals and full benefits. We gave medals and full benefits for those people who were killed on 9/11 at the Pentagon. As soon as we get our appropriations bills finished, I'm going to be asking the leader to put it on the floor.
For the victims and their families, the Purple Heart would represent a significant step in healing.
Bliss. It would be a great feeling to be awarded the Purple Heart, to show that the blood that was shed that day wasn't in vain.
My husband did not die in vain, and he was a courageous man, and although he was not in an active war zone, that war zone came to him, so they need to justify that.
I may never see anything in regards to compensation, but I just want accountability, our federal government, to say, hey, we're responsible. You know, if that's all we ever got, that, you know, that's fine with me.
More than 4 years have passed since Kim Munley was assured by the president that things would be taken care of. Yet there have been no medals and no reparations. Munley says she would welcome the opportunity to speak to the president.
I would ask him why. Give me a reason and not an excuse that I've already heard for the reason why this has not been reclassified as terrorism. And I don't even care if it's not reclassified as terrorism. You can do an executive order, you can take care of these soldiers. Why haven't you done it? Plain and simple.
The Army declined our request for an on-camera interview for this story. However, they did provide us with a statement. We'll have their response when For the Record returns. In October 2013, Congressman Joe Wilson of South Carolina contacted the Department of Defense requesting an update on the presentation of Purple Hearts to the victims of Fort Hood. On November 1st, the Secretary of the Army, John McHugh, responded to Wilson in a letter saying, "I have directed my staff to conduct a thorough review of the record of trial in the court-martial of Major Hassan to ascertain if those proceedings revealed new evidence or information that establishes clearly the necessary link to international terrorism." As we prepared this story for air, the Army has yet to update Wilson on the status of that review. Now, we have to make an important point here. During Hassan's trial, the judge, Colonel Tara Osborne, limited prosecutors from introducing evidence that would establish Hassan's jihadi motives, including his communications with international terrorist Anwar al-Awlaki, meaning the evidence that directly tied Hassan to international terrorism was struck from the trial record. For the Record contacted the Army directly, and as I mentioned, representatives declined our request for an interview. However, they did provide a statement which reads in part, "While there has been no intelligence or findings to date that indicate Hassan was under the direction or control of a foreign element, we stand ready to act accordingly should any evidence to the contrary be presented." We have since followed up with the Army and directed them to page 62 of the Webster Report, which details an encounter between Anwar al-Awlaki and an FBI informant after the Fort Hood shooting. According to that report, the informant claims that al-Awlaki told him that he instructed Hassan to kill American soldiers and that he gave him permission to carry out his attacks at Fort Hood. We contacted the Army again and asked if this meets the threshold they've set for linking Hassan to international terrorism. When they respond, we'll add that to our show page at theblaze.com/fortherecord, where you can also find copies of the documents we've referenced in this episode and an update on the victims you met here tonight. That's our show for this evening. I'm Lori Dew. We'll see you next week on For the Record.